Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the industry panel discussion that's part of our 2021 State of Housing and Charlotte Summit. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and found it informative, if not sobering. As co-author of the report, I can assure you you'll want to review the whole report, as there are a lot of details, facts, figures, and analyses that we simply didn't have time to discuss in today's presentation. So at this point, you're probably wondering how you can see the full report. Well, stay tuned, because following our discussion, I'll share the link so you can do just that. By way of introduction, I'm Kip Womack, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm an associate professor of real estate in the Belk College of Business, and as mentioned earlier, co-author of the housing report. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Kris Fountain. Kris is the Vice President of Family Services for the Habitat Charlotte region. His department prepares, educates, and advocates for homebuyers and homeowners in Mecklenburg and Iredell counties through Habitat Charlotte region's homebuyer and critical home repair programs. He has over 20 years of affordable housing experience, so I'm very much looking forward to hearing his thoughts. Welcome, Kris. I think your audio is still muted.
Thanks, Kip.
Thanks.
Thanks
Looks like we have similar
on.
taste and fashion. Next, let me introduce David Kennedy. David serves as the current president of the Canopy Realtors Association and Canopy MLS. As a realtor with more than 15 years experience, David's primary real estate experience has been in the area of property management. I also want to note that David participated in last year's panel and did such a good job that we brought him again this year. So thanks again for joining us, David.
Kip, glad to be here, man. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Last but certainly not least, we have Todd Williams. Todd's the Chief Investment Officer at Grubb Properties and is responsible for leading the company's private equity real estate investment programs and institutional joint ventures. He has more than 25 years of industry experience, and Todd serves as a board of director on our Childress Klein Center of Real Estate. Welcome, Todd. Always great to see you.
Thank you, Kip. I appreciate it.
All right, so before we get started, just one more time, we're going to remind our online audience, you can submit questions to us via the chat function. We're going to try to address as many of those as we can in the last 10 minutes or so of the panel. But without further delay, let's just go ahead and jump into the conversation. So I think maybe the best place to start for us is to get each of your reactions to the presentation we all just watched. More specifically, what really stood out to you, and do the conclusions from the report correspond to what you're seeing in your day-to-day business? So we'll just go in the order that you were presented. So Kris, why don't you kick us off?
Well, thank you so much. Boy, it was a fantastic presentation and learned a lot. One of the things that really stood out for me is just the tremendous owner-occupant market growth for single-family residencies. To actually experience in 2021 a 16% growth rate compared to the last decade at 6%. I mean, that's almost 3 times the growth rate is phenomenal. And serving as a vice president of family services at Habitat Charlotte region, we have certainly seen that particular demand, particularly for the homeowners that we actually, or home buyers that we actually serve. And so I certainly can agree with each and every one of those stats that he had, but probably just to take it home, Kip, in terms of, the people that we represent are low to moderate income families. They're hardworking families. They're considered what many people would call essential workers. And it is just really disproportionate in terms of how COVID and this pandemic has impacted them. And so I'm looking forward to having more dialogue about that. But that was one of the things that really stood out for me.
Okay, David, how about you?
There's so many dynamics to unpack that drive the supply and demand of this housing market, and that's really what stood out for me. Dealing in the real estate business and a lot in the Canopy MLS, being president of it, and you guys using that data. It just kind of resonates so much with what Dr. Chu said. Charlotte is one of the most desirable places in America to live. Remote working makes it easier to move here because you don't have to live here or live near where you work. And once you move here, you stay because it's awesome. And that's only the demand represented by those owner occupants or the families out there buying. Dr. Chu mentioned 25% of the market's buyers are iBuyers now, with far more buying power where the popular misconception of realtors, brokerages, fees being fixed at like 6% is clearly debunked, because these business models in the real estate market, they vary tremendously, as do the fees associated with it and all the various business models. So we make it a very pro-consumer landscape when you can actually find something to buy. We're still a market where no one is leaving. Investors who started iBuying during the recession, they're not selling because they want to avoid capital gains taxes, and boomers aren't moving, they're living their best life. So multiple reasons behind the supply and demand. I could unpack it all day, but I loved what Dr. Chu said and excited to talk about it.
Okay, Todd, what were your thoughts?
Sure. First of all, I just want to say how much I really do appreciate the regional approach to the report, which I think is critical. I know I'm stating the obvious here, but Charlotte, it's of course not just a single city, but it's a large region with many cities and counties. And as we all know, residents and housing markets just don't recognize political boundaries. So I think it's really important that we continue to study housing needs and dynamics across a broader geography. And really, the metropolitan region is the functional and economic unit. And so, to that end, I think one of the things that was amazing for me to see was the distribution of apartment units by county and the overwhelming concentration in Mecklenburg County, roughly 3/4, if I remember the report correctly. But, I think what struck me the most is I suspect that over the next decade, we will see that shift some. And I think that will have important implications on housing and land use policy in the cities and counties outside of Charlotte proper, especially if the cost trends that are identified in the report, continue to exacerbate affordability with respect to home ownership. So, I think that was just a really interesting aspect of the report that was pretty shocking to me. I had no idea that concentration was quite nearly as tipped and heavy to the central county.
Yeah, pretty much almost every statistic you want to take a look at, whether it's population growth, whether it's housing inventory, whatever, it roughly shakes out where Mecklenburg has half of it, and then the surrounding counties have the remaining half. That is kind of remarkable how kind of a good rule of thumb that kind of is throughout the data, no matter what you're looking at. So your point is right on. So let's get into some specific questions. So David, I want to go back to you when we were talking about the double-digit increases in both rents and housing prices. When I was putting together some of the numbers, I actually had I always double check my work, but I actually had to triple check my work. It's like, is this right? 2021, 16% almost across the board, whether you're talking about Class A, Class B, Class C rentals, single family, in the housing and the housing values. And so I want to get your perspective on just how historic these recent price and rental increases are, and where does this put Charlotte region in terms of overall affordability?
So I thank you for the question. I think it is a watershed market, so to speak, and the turning point is based upon the nationwide demand to live in Charlotte and the increased ability and flexibility now to move. Inflation's at a 30-year high, and the housing market is not immune to it. And in a basic way, we all have too much money chasing too few goods. And in our case, those goods are housing. This is detrimental to overall affordability. Even further, perhaps one of the reasons why a vulnerable market share is the lowest 10th percentile, as Dr. Chu mentioned, is the home prices, because the population, as the population dramatically increases, therein lies a net increase of people that need housing, and most people are searching for housing at or near the maximum amount that they can afford. So when competition is robust, i.e. too many buyers chasing too few homes, not all buyers can shift their price point higher due to an inability to afford it. So they shift it lower, they buy or they rent down at a lower price point. And this happens on the sales market, particularly where you could get an offer to purchase at a higher price consistent with what those buyers could buy at their original price point. And that has an effect on the market. That lack of supply in their initial price point makes them go lower. And then when a higher bidder wins the competition for that unit of housing, that process repeats itself. It trickles down, cycles down, all the way down to the lowest 10 percentile, where people are outbidding buyers who can only afford housing at that first rung of the homeownership ladder, effectively making it harder to buy across the board.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we point out is that adding housing at any level is going to help affordable housing because of the scenario that you just laid out. So many times affordable housing is cast as building for those incomes, but really any new housing is going to help because of that. All right, so Kris, so there's an interesting report that came out from our colleagues from Chapel Hill, and they found that 21 counties in the state have residents that face severe cost burden from rent payments, as well as lack critical facilities. And this was referring to they're lacking some kind of fully functioning bathroom, HVAC system or something like that in their rental units. Many residents are paying 50% of their gross monthly income towards rent, forcing many residents to potentially choose between paying rent or paying for life necessities like bills, groceries, essential meds. On top of that, some overcrowded living conditions also is an issue. And in some areas, unfortunately, all three of those factors can be faced simultaneously. So can you talk more about the cost burdens some renters are facing, especially through the lens of the programs that Habitat for Humanity offers?
That's a great question, Kip. Be more than happy to do that. One of the things that we take pride as it relates to Habitat is that we offer affordable housing and affordable mortgages. And just like with Dr. Chu had said, and of course, the Department of HUD has also kind of basically provided the standard that affordable means that no more than 30% of a household's gross monthly income should go towards housing or housing expenses, including utilities and so forth. We have found personally, and the people that we serve and even beyond, that 50%, I say that again, 50% of households' gross monthly income is going towards rent for some communities and some renters. That is a significant amount of money. And I want to emphasize gross monthly income, as you know, does not mean take home or net pay. So there are a lot of families who are quite frankly faced in our entire region, whether it's urban, suburban, or rural, where they're actually faced with essentially making hard decisions on whether they pay their rent or whether they actually pay for other life necessities like paying for utilities or prescription medication or something like that. And so what we try to do as best as we can is to provide education to renters and talk to them about how they can come into our home buyer program and become homeowners. And as everybody pretty much well knows, I won't rehash the whole qualifications, but our business model is volunteer driven and community led. And certainly we try to take that cost of what we typically get in-kind donations and volunteer labor, we try to actually transfer that savings over to the homeowner to make the home more affordable. But one of the things that we do, Kip, whether it's Habitat Charlotte Region or any other Habitat affiliate, is that we basically have the standard that no particular homeowner will pay more than 30% of their household gross monthly income towards a mortgage, and that includes escrows as well, taxes and insurance, and so forth. So that's our commitment, and that's something that we've been doing since 1976 when we were first founded. And the Habitat Charlotte region was founded in 1982, and so we're proud to be a part of that effort.
Very excellent. I want to come back to you later on and talk about your other what Habitat does regarding repairs, and that's a kind of a doesn't get a lot of attention. It was certainly something when we were talking earlier about it. So we'll come back to you for that. By the way, I should mention to the other panelists, if you guys want to respond to the comments from the panelists, you're more than welcome to respond. All right. So we'll go on to our next question. So this is something I've heard a lot of concern about. So student loan payments are unfortunately resetting. my own included, in February. So you had that, you had the eviction moratoriums ending, government payments curtailing. So, and this is just a question for everybody. So how are these dynamics going to affect affordable housing in the near future? Is it catastrophic? Is it, you know, is it going to be a smooth transition with those things happening, or what's your feel?
You know,
Got a
I'm
unique
happy.
approach. Go ahead, Todd. Go ahead, Todd.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say I'm happy to comment on that. I think many of the pandemic support programs were, obviously critical over the past 20 months or so, but I do think it's important to recognize that because they're not permanent, they have somewhat masked the underlying problem. And when they're pulled away, the affordability challenges, will only be worse. So one of the unintended consequences of having these in place for an extended period of time is that they skew data and they incentivize behaviors that will not be sustainable when they disappear. So it's making it truly hard to understand what the underlying conditions really are. And there are all sorts of challenges that it creates in the private sector that actually inhibit the production of housing. While that's less the case in the Carolinas, for example, this has become a very profound problem in states like California, with some of the most, which are some of the most housing challenged regions in the country. We're actually building a number of projects out there right now, and it really has become a prohibiting factor to the production of housing in many of those regions.
I've got a unique approach in that looking at credit reports, on a daily basis. If I have an applicant for a rental property that has student loans, it's not a huge red flag. I'm not a credit repair expert, but I'm under the impression that student loans, their interest rates are low, and it's not like the Department of Education can come repossess your education. So that might be the last thing that someone looks to pay off. That might be a decision that they make. So it's not a huge, I think, red flag if somebody's carrying around student loan debt. But that's just me from a rental perspective. When the eviction moratoriums and one thing, at least our software that we use at my firm, TR Realty, Appfolio won't report anything during the pandemic, and I applaud that. So if you have late payments or an eviction on your record during the pandemic, you get a bit of a break. And I think we're all kind of doing the best we can during the pandemic. So I'm okay with not exactly knowing all the dirty secrets. And then finally, government payments curtailing. I think from what I can read, and I'm not 100% sure, I feel like the government did the best they could with projecting what was needed because we couldn't wait till we actually knew exactly what we needed. So, they could estimate 1 million payrolls were not going to be met. Therefore, we have to start sending people money when in fact only 250,000 payrolls weren't met. So I think Todd's, comments were on point that, it could lead to some misconceptions. And I think a lot of that was based on, the government having to do something fast in order to get help to people. And, they did it based off of projections to what they thought would be the safest thing.
I think this is great, David and Todd. You guys make some great and excellent comments. I think on my end, from an underwriting perspective, one of the things with Habitat, we're not credit score driven. So other, things such as capacity, the debt that you carry, and those things of that nature definitely play a big role, including student loans, whether they're in forbearance or deferment or what have you. Oftentimes we have to, as a compensating factor, even if a payment isn't being made, we have to kind of pretty much place a payment on that, if you will. Maybe it's 1% of the total balance of that particular student loan, simply because we have to forecast out, sustainability and capacity of that particular homeowner, not just for today, but moving forward 5, 10, 15 years from now as a homeowner. So it does certainly play a role for us, simply because we hang our hat on that capacity and debt load, probably more so than any of the other C's to home ownership, if you will, since we don't factor in credit scores when we're evaluating any particular family.
Okay. All right. So one of the main themes from our findings was this ongoing imbalance between supply and demand. So Todd, this is a question for you. So can you discuss these dynamics in the housing segment that you focus on, and then talk about maybe about your line of business with the essential housing?
Sure. I think it's important to look at overall housing demand across an extended period of time, and to put that in perspective to what we're seeing now. After the global financial crisis, we had a housing glut in the US, and this was quickly mopped up by a massive demographic demand with the millennials entering the workforce. So millennials, as a reminder, are generally bracketed between 1980 and 1998. So the oldest today is 39 and the youngest is roughly 23. So this group is going to continue to impact the market as they age, and they'll have a whole host of different housing needs as they go through those cycles. What most people don't realize, though, is that peak births in the US didn't occur until 2007. Well, that's almost 9 years after the last millennium. So we're facing another decade plus of increased housing demand in the young workforce segment that will actually rival that of the last decade. And at the same time, over the last decade in the US, we've not created enough supply to even keep up with the 50-year historic average. In fact, you have to go all the way back to 1982 to find a single year of lower production than we've had over the last 10 years annually. And there's lots of reasons for that: housing policy, antiquated housing agencies, construction inflation, financing restrictions put in place after the GFC, labor supply. I mean, the list goes on. So it's a real challenge. We are operating a strategy in a space that we call essential housing. I'll talk about that a little bit later here. But it's a national brand called Link Apartments that we're building all across the country that's really focused on a particular segment of the housing industry, really focused on these young people that are housing challenged today and will continue to be over the next decade.
All right. So a related question. You mentioned briefly about construction costs. So how are those dynamics? How are you guys dealing with these, the inflation? And it seems like every day we're hearing a new story. I just saw I think right before the panel session, there's a report from CoStar reporting higher than expected inflation in recent months. So how is that impacting the essential housing?
It's been a big topic over the last couple of years because we've heard, a lot of impact issues, things like lumber pricing and stuff like that have been exacerbated by the pandemic itself. But the reality is we've had excessive construction inflation now for quite some time. Really, over the last 8 years in the US, inflation in our industry, in the multifamily industry anyways, has been at a pace almost twice that of headline CPI and more than twice that of wage growth in the US. And so that means that on a relative basis, workers are losing ground, especially for those in more wage growth restrictive segments, say between 60% of AMI and 120%. So the way we tackle this is really kind of two principal strategies. First, we use design efficiency. And so with our Link apartment strategy, we build just 6 unit floor plans and we duplicate them across every community we build. So now if you walk onto an average apartment community in the US today, it would not be unusual to have 25 different unit floor plan types. In fact, I just recently walked through a 400 unit community in Denver, Colorado that had, believe it or not, 100 different unit floor plans. Now, I'm a recovering architect and urban planner, actually trained here at UNC Charlotte. And I can tell you that there's just no way you can create efficiency with that many unit types. We found that, by focusing on efficiency, it benefits us in design, in construction, and in operations. And then the second way we've been tackling it is through a whole range of techniques and methods that we use to drive down the cost or generate other streams of revenue or reduce recurring operating expenses. And those range from direct subsidies that we can secure for providing moderate price rental housing to subsidies that we self-generate. So, for example, one of our favorite methods is to use our commercial division to acquire older vintage office buildings. Now, what does an office building have to do with housing? Well, we can take those buildings that come with surface parking lots and we can repurpose the land for housing through entitlement. And when we're able to do that, we can essentially generate land for free for the housing because it comes with the office. And we can ultimately share that parking between housing and office in a new parking deck, creating both a parking capital cost savings as well as an ongoing operating expense reduction for both uses. So here in Charlotte, if you want to see an example of that, we have a project called Link Apartments Montford. It's just located near the Park Road Shopping Center. It's a case study for this strategy, and it's really the result of 2 office acquisitions that we did about 5 years ago that's now allowing us to build about 550 units of this housing type, serving residents between 60% and 140% of AMI.
That's really interesting. And I'm personally glad to see that it's not all about just new construction, tearing down trees and putting up new buildings. It's about, there are plenty of properties out of their highest and best use that can be repurposed for housing. So that's great to hear. So David, circling back to you. In addition to rising construction costs, a lack of supply also seems to be a large supply driver of the cost of housing. So what role, if any, does government regulation play in the inability of builders to catch up with the demand that Todd just pointed out?
All right, I'll take the 3 levels of government, and I'm going to shout out to my good friend Faith Triggs, who asked a question about what government regulations would you like to see. Faith is vice president of the Charlotte Crown chapter of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. And what I would do nationally is I would tell all of these investors that bought, single-family homes that were foreclosed upon back in 2007, 8, and 9. I would tell them as the federal government, hey, I know you're facing a big tax bill for capital gains taxes, but I'll give you a break on the taxes you have to pay if you agree to sell that property you've been making money off of all these years to someone that Kris helps, someone that does 30% API, somebody that has problems with finding affordable housing. To me, that's a win-win situation. Government regulation could be a good thing in that sense from a national perspective to help, incentivize investors who are a little heavy on their portfolio to introduce those homes back into the market, just like Todd was saying, not necessarily building new, but figuring out what already exists and what we can work with. On a state level, I'm really pleased with the corporate tax rate that the state of North Carolina has. I think we rank 44th in the United States, which means we got a very low corporate tax rate, which means conditions are favorable for corporations to move here and bring their employees. So I like that from the state level. Builders, they're still looking to meet the demand that local regulations can give us. So locally speaking, I think 25% or 25 cents of every dollar spent on construction goes to regulatory fees. So, housing permits, they're very costly these days. And those regulatory fees are made up of things like stormwater regulation fees, water tap fees, building permits. These are all good things, by the way, but do they have to make up 25% of the overall cost to build? I think there's room to explore that. But generally speaking, I think increased government regulation can lead to increased cost to build. And the people who are hurt the most by that are the ones looking for real estate in the affordable housing sector. So if builders and developers can't make the numbers work in the affordable sector, then they'll just build where they can. And you got to get really creative with stuff like Todd and Grubb Properties are doing, which is incredibly impressive. I have Creating the Urban Dream by Clay Grubb on my bookshelf up there. I mean, what they're doing is incredible. Charlotte needs that type of thinking, but also some less regulation, less cost to build in order to meet the demand coming in.
Very interesting.
David Kennedy for president. Yay. Well said, my friend.
That's great. David, kind of changing subjects just a little bit, but sticking with you. So we've talked earlier about the tremendous increase in demand and migration into the area. We're one of the top 10 cities for population migration. I think we're one of only like a dozen cities that have had 100,000 more population growth in, I think, in the prior year. So basically, I guess the question on some of the, I think I've seen in the chat on the research presentation, they're asking something similar. Why are these people moving? Where are these people moving from, and why? Has the pandemic changed migration patterns? And if so, you think that's a permanent, like a one-time transitory change in migration patterns, or is it something that we're going to continue to see in the near future? And then lastly, kind of, how has Charlotte kind of gotten it right as far as being that, as that city, the area that attracts all this migration?
So I think people are coming from everywhere, it feels like, and I think it's larger metropolitan areas primarily, like New York, New Jersey, DMV, which is DC, Maryland, and Virginia. They're also coming from Miami. And I got that from the Charlotte Business Alliance presentation at our Canopy Real Estate Institute, Hot Topics presentation last week. So New York, New Jersey, DMV, and Miami, that's where most people are coming from. And what they have in common is that they are large metropolitan areas. What they like is the access to good jobs here. They love lower taxes, relatively speaking, and they feel like Charlotte is less densely populated compared to where they're coming from. So, and it's affordable for them. The other thing that you mentioned was the pandemic-infused phenomenon of remote working. This has changed migration patterns because workers are no longer tethered to where they work. For many people, when they move here, they don't have to worry about balancing a commute with affordability. Now they can just come and live wherever they want to live and not worry about traffic patterns and getting into the office. I feel like that we could call this the great reshuffling. Now, the downside to this is folks that are native Charlotteans, folks that have lived in Charlotte for a long time under our rate of growth, our rate of inflation, our cost of living. We're having to now compete with this steady influx of new transplants, bringing their larger market buying power to Charlotte. Effectively, they're kind of outbidding most of the native Charlotteans. And in my opinion, the response in terms of what I think Charlotte has gotten right is many things, but Charlotte's response to all this demand is something that I applaud. And I think it's the city's attempt to meet the demand of all these people coming here in an intelligent way through that 2040 comprehensive plan, the UDO. This is a huge lift, but I think in order to meet the demand, that Charlotte is going to have to become a little bit more densely populated. And we're not growing just to grow, which is something I think we're getting right. Many people may think we're slow because we lack the supply, but we're not just building to build. We're actually trying to figure out what is the most intelligent way, what's the most intelligent place to grow, where is the right type of housing for the right situation. So I think Charlotte is getting that right as we speak, and I applaud that.
So you touched on exactly where I wanted to go next, and it's hard to have a conversation these days about real estate without talking about the comprehensive plan, the UDO. And so you've chimed in. I wanted to ask Todd and Kris maybe their input about the UDO, and how do you think this is going to affect affordable housing in the area?
Sure, I'm happy to dive in. Look, I kind of pull back and say, what are the four major tools that cities and regions have to shape their future? And the first is, of course, plans and studies, and those usually involve the community in that process. The second is that they can establish policies around things like land use or economic development or housing, for example. The third is they can establish or modify regulations. And the fourth is they can make direct investments or provide economic incentives or build new infrastructure facilities. And so, as a former urban and regional planner, I can tell you that a successful region is one that secures regional buy-in and then implements across all four of those categories in a coordinated way. A plan by itself just won't succeed. There are plenty of examples of plan documents that sit on shelves, and irrespective of how visionary they were. So, Charlotte has historically been a leader in the Carolinas on things like land use planning, transit, multimodal logistics, economic development. Many of these things and others are what has really made our region so attractive and why we've had the growth we've had. But it's absolutely critical that we continue to improve the product, and success in the past is just not going to ensure that we have success in the future. In fact, really past success, which is causing growth, can really create problems like we see in housing today.
Kris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, we at Habitat, we've been a proponent of the plan since day one and have been an advocate from our board all the way to our staff. And so certainly with our challenges that we face with, again, what Dr. Cho said in terms of supply and demand, land and land cost, raw material costs, all those things are impacting, our overall impact on what we can actually do. That being said, we're pivoting in terms of, we're still in the single family residency business on our home buyer side, but we're also actually building townhomes, just for the simple fact that we can build more with less in terms of the land. And so, we're still in the single family business, but we're in the townhome business now too, as well.
So,
Kip,
go ahead.
I tell you, man, I like the 2040 plan. I like the UDO. I feel like it's very academic, and that I'm reading a doctoral thesis at times, which should be nothing for you, Kip. It should be very easy for you to do, but for me, I don't understand it all. But I'm proud of the direction that we're going. So I feel like a little shaky, like a kid riding a bicycle for the first time without training wheels whenever I talk about it. But because Charlotte is a top 10 housing market, and in order for us to continue our trajectory of growth, we got to become a little bit more densely populated. So the city's planning department has these policy maps out right now, and they're inviting community engagement, and they're inviting feedback. And these maps, to me, as I'm riding my bike kind of shaky, they feel like a companion guide to the 2040 plan. The plan's aspiration is to, for what I can understand, provide an equitable growth framework to increase density and accommodate the net migration that we're seeing in Charlotte. And that infill's got to come over the next 20 years. So the plan illustrates through these maps a way to determine where the density should go. So one of the folks in the chat was like, hey, are there places other than, the hot spots for development to come? And I believe there are. Now, the UDO to me feels like the rules with which everything is applied. That's the eventual law. And the problem, and this is just, I feel like I'm nitpicking because overall I think this is great, but sometimes what we see is, and this is the first draft to my understanding, is that sometimes you can find a disconnect in areas where what the 2040 plan aspires to do and what the UDO will allow to do. So you can have an overall aspiration to encourage redevelopment of buildings like Todd mentioned that they do. And so developers will want to do that. When they do, sometimes they'll be asked or required to build and redevelop the roads. And that's an additional cost. And it's not just redeveloping the roads the way they are now. They'll have to add things like a bike lane, a 6-foot setback, 6-foot sidewalks and additional setbacks. So those things are more regulations that lead to more costs and could deter some developers in those areas that need the development from doing those type of projects. So what we want to do is just in some areas know that, hey, where you want the redevelopment, where you want the refurbishing, you might not be able to hang the redevelopment of like roads and stuff on the developer. In that case, it may be a case-by-case basis. Some developers could absorb it based on the cost of the land that they're dealing with, but in other, or the value of the land. But if the value of land is different in another place of Charlotte, they might not be able to absorb it. So I feel like I'm nitpicking a little bit, but I love the plan overall. I like what we're trying to do. And I'm glad we're talking about it because right now is the time we need to be giving feedback to the city based upon their maps. And I think Tyler just put it in the chat. You can click on that thing and make sure where you're living looks right to you.
Yeah, if you haven't looked at the maps, it actually is very interesting. And the community is a couple of properties I looked at in areas. The community response, it seemed like they're providing some good feedback to the current designations. Sticking with this theme about planning, Kris, you mentioned something in our conversation earlier this week about that the largest and fastest growing cohort of both renters and homeowners is female-headed households. And this is a trend, urban, suburban, rural, all of it. So how should this trend impact how we market, build, and showcase home and community amenities?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, Kip. I know one thing for us, female-headed households, which is being led by the largest generational cohort, which is millennials. It is really fascinating in terms of how we need to really kind of re-engage how we market our product being the home, and more specifically, emphasis on walkable neighborhoods, emphasis on other community type amenities, whether it be cycling, whether it be other community events and things of that nature. Even community gardening and stuff like that are things that I think would be things that certainly would appeal. But one of the things that I think is really important is that, we all have to make those adjustments from a mindset. Now, I've been in the real estate business for about 20 years. I used to be in another life a real estate broker. And even in the 1980s, 80s and 90s, whether it was the family was led by a female or not, they were the decision makers. And I speak this not just as an experienced real estate broker, but as a father and a husband, and I've got all women in the house, and so they're the bosses, and that hasn't changed. But one thing that certainly has changed is that when it comes to the financing and everything else like that, either women are the ones who are the breadwinners. They may be the sole proponent person that's actually in the household or whatnot. But it has certainly changed the dynamic of how we market, what we emphasize, what's important. There are some certainly commonalities that are important to everyone, but I think that special attention needs to be made when it comes to this emerging cohort. It's not just millennials, but millennials more specifically. When you kind of go beyond the veil, it's really women, females who are really driving the market at this point.
Very interesting. So we are coming close to our Q&A session time, but there's two more topics I want to address, make sure that we fit in before we do so. And this is, Kris, going back, touching on the point that kind of we mentioned earlier about home repairs. So you have a unique perspective on an important facet of affordable housing that doesn't get much attention at all, and that's deferred maintenance. So there's a significant demand from aging homeowners with fixed incomes who need critical, in some cases, emergency home repairs for older homes. Common needs that you've noted include water damage caused by the need to repair or replace roofs, or major plumbing repairs like leaks. So what programs are available to address the deterioration of the existing housing stock in these scenarios?
Great question. We certainly have our critical home repair program that we have at Habitat Charlotte Region. It's a comprehensive plan in the sense that at one point in time, decades ago, we would just simply address one particular critical need, and then a family would have to come back the next year to reapply for another one. Now we're looking at it, we're doing scope of work, making an assessment, and just taking a look at all of the needs. Now, the average cost is anywhere from $30,000 to about $35,000 per home. I saw in the chat where someone had asked a question, what are some of the policies that you would like to see change? I would certainly like to see state, county, and city funding more CDBG money going towards this particular cohort, because as you said, Kip, we really don't talk about it a lot, but we do still have aging housing stock with aging homeowners. And so that's kind of like the combination that we're seeing and we're experiencing at Habitat, where we're helping individuals, and the median age of these individuals are like 66 years of age. Their income is somewhere between 30 to 80% of AMI, but most of the folks are on a fixed income. And so there has been deferred maintenance that has happened that may have started, Kip, as just an anthill, a minor plumbing problem. But over time, as you know, if it is not addressed, that anthill becomes a mountain, and so that's kind of the things that we're looking at. And we just deal with what we call the critical needs. So it's the roofing, it's the plumbing, it's HVAC system, it's, you know, subflooring and things of that nature. It's not cosmetic. And so, you know, our average age of our homes, that most of them are built in the 1960s and 70s in most cases. And so there's just, you know, again, I think there's this niche and there's this cohort that doesn't get a lot of attention. And I really appreciate the question you bringing this up, because I think it needs to get more attention, because again, you still have that aging housing stock with aging homeowners that certainly need funding as it relates. Last point I would make here is that, just to kind of let you know, we're going to help this particular fiscal year. We're going to actually help about 160 families in our service area. Now, we service Mecklenburg, most of Mecklenburg County, with the exception of Matthews, and all of Iredell County. That's 160 families. But get this, the applications that we process in a given year is about 500. So even what we're doing is still not enough. There are other programs that are out there, like For the Struggle. They help in terms of that. But again, there's more demand than there is, you know, in terms of the actual need. And so there's definitely that imbalance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was kind of, you know, heartbreaking when we were talking about earlier this week, and it's something that it totally makes sense once you address the issue, but it's just, you just don't think about, you know, all this maintenance that needs to be done, and some of it could, you know, is dangerous, you know, dangerous living conditions that need to be addressed for sure. So we're getting about time to looking at, been peeking a little bit, as our panelists have, at the chat questions. It appears that we have a number of government officials that have tuned in, so we thank you so much for your participation. Philip Gussman, Chair of the Charlotte Planning Commission. I think we've addressed the UDO question. But we do have, so there's Mecklenburg Commissioner Elaine Powell has asked, is there any research or conversation about micro units as a solution to the affordability in urban areas? So that'd be an open question for any of our panelists.
Sure, I'm happy to jump on that one. You know, the segment that we focus on is the area in the middle between luxury housing on one end of the spectrum and affordable housing at the other end, what we think of as kind of the missing middle. And, you know, this is the segment that serves residents generally between 60% of AMI and 140%. You know, we think of it as kind of renter by necessity. And so micro units have become a really important component of what we're building in our Link apartment product. Our units on average range about 650 square feet across, an average community for us. But that means we have units that are as small as 384 square feet, all the way up to about 1,150 square feet. So kind of a broad range of unit types. But because we're focusing on this segment that we call essential housing, which is generally the young workforce today, the millennials and Gen Zs that I mentioned earlier, this is primarily micro units, studios, ones, and some 2-bedroom units, but not a lot of emphasis on larger bedroom unit configurations. That's certainly a segment that's more closer to the workforce housing segment. But the segment we focus on is in particular this segment that deals with everything from those micro units all the way up to a typical unit that might apply for a dual income family with no kids.
Okay. So here's a question directed to Kris. So your customer base fits the profile of households affected by pandemic challenges. What patterns did you see in mortgage holder delinquency, and have you seen a resolution to these delinquencies, or are they still behind in payments?
Great question. Just kind of looking at our own inventory, as you might imagine, back in the beginning of 2000, we had a significant rise in delinquencies. Again, most of our homeowners are anywhere from the 30% to 80% AMI. Most of them, as I said before, are essential workers, so they were definitely impacted. And quite frankly, most of them are people of color. So many of us already know that the pandemic has disproportionately impacted people of color. And so what we have done, we have seen in the I'd say the last quarter, we have started to see things stabilize in terms of our delinquency. And part of that is because of our partnership with community partnering agencies in our service area who we partnered with, who have kind of helped us with housing counseling and helping with basically loss mitigation options for many of our severely delinquent borrowers. And that has made great inroads in getting them reinstated, because that's what we're really all about. We want to, we want to definitely keep people in their homes as best as we can. And so, so to answer the question, short answer essentially is that we saw a significant uptick all of last year, but now since the last quarter, we've seen things stabilize and actually go down. And part of it is because of the great effort. I can't take credit for it. It's really the staff at Habitat for Humanity and the partners that we use, like Dream Key and Prosperity Unlimited and others that have kind of helped us, in Livian and so forth, that have helped us along the way.
Very good. Here's a great question, and we can maybe do this one round robin style in the order that you were introduced. So the question is, and this might be Commissioner Powell question, but what is at least one housing policy that you would like to see implemented that would balance the needs of the housing industry and consumers? That is balancing between profit and affordable rentals and homeownership. So we'll start off with you, Kris.
That's a great question. Just my knee-jerk reaction, I would like to see maybe on the rental side, some kind of policy where if there's any type of rental development or anything else like that, whether it's small scale or large scale development, that there would be a percentage that would be earmarked for low to moderate income families. But I'm a big proponent in it making sense, dollars and cents for everyone involved. I know that myself, as well as our CEO, Laura Belcher, we're working on a plan to just really come up with a case of support, if you will, to show and to illustrate to developers that it can be a win-win situation. You don't have to get a haircut, so to speak, financially in order for you to actually accommodate and service low to moderate income families. So that'd be one of the things that I would be definitely interested in seeing.
Okay, David.
Here's what I would do. I would, if I was an elected official, I would go to Enlivian and go to Fulton Meacham and say, tell me what you need to go to HUD and get them to expand the Section 8 housing platform so that more people can own the home instead of Section 8 money getting filtered in from Section 8 and Enlivian and then into a landlord's pocket. Why can't it go to an owner occupant? So number one, they have a consistent place to stay. Number two, they build equity. And number three, they have a sense of ownership and belonging. So if I had something if I had a wish list, some regulation, it would be to not necessarily tinker what we already have. It would to be to create something that says, hey, Section 8 is a great program. We already do some stuff where we work with trying to get them to be homeowners, but let's expand that so that now the Section 8 program will result hopefully into home ownership instead of just consistent renting. That equity is built and maintained within the Charlotte MSA, and it doesn't go out to an out-of-state or out-of-country investor.
Okay, Todd.
Yeah, for me, I think parking policy would be high on my list. Parking, has become one of the greatest enemies to housing affordability. In a 250 unit community, parking can account for, as much as $35,000 per unit in cost or more. That translates to, call it $175 to $200 a month in rent just to park a big piece of metal. So if you think about that, one of the greatest ways to make housing more affordable is to eliminate parking. But that's a challenge. In most zoning codes today all across the country, parking is required, of course, but it's actually a minimum. I mean, it's actually a minimum standard instead of a maximum standard. And you know, that has a profound impact on housing affordability. And by the way, a car costs a resident on average about $9,000 per year. So this is a huge burden on young people today. And I think transit's an important aspect of that. Transit policy, creating high density urban locations that are walkable to key job centers. All of these things are kind of intertwined, but I think if I had to pick one, parking would be a favorite one. We're actually involved in an experimental project right now in West Charlotte, where we'll be constructing an apartment community, about 100-unit apartment community with no parking. And instead we'll be relying on greenway and bike and pedestrian links and location in a location near transit accessible stations. We're hoping that this community can qualify residents at or even marginally below that 60% of AMI threshold, without really any subsidy. This will be a market project. So it'll be experimental, and we're anxious to see how that works and how receptive it is in the community.
Todd, is that Seaverville?
It is. That's the Seaverville project.
I applaud you for that. And I'm excited to see how that one turns out. I admire that. And I feel like, depending on how this one goes, I thought to myself, what if you build in, electric rental cars? You just have 4 cars just sitting there. Somebody really needs a car, they can reserve it and go. What you've introduced is a worthwhile endeavor. And
it's David, that's a great suggestion. We're actually already taking you up on that. And some of our latest projects will have rentable Teslas that are charged in our shared parking garages. And then in addition to that, we have been spending a lot of money and time and energy on our bicycle infrastructure in our communities. And so we have these facilities that we actually call cycle centers, which are like bike storage facilities and maintenance facilities on steroids. They're incredible resources for our residents to be able to utilize bicycle infrastructure in our city. And hopefully, that's another policy area where, just to grab a second one that I'd love to see, which is more bicycle infrastructure, because I think that could be a very profound way to, to help impact the cost of housing.
All right, so we have a bunch of questions. We're running out of time. We only have a few minutes left. To everyone who submitted questions and that we didn't get to them, apologize about that, but hopefully we can keep the conversation going, throughout the community on this topic. In the few minutes that we have left, I just wanted to give everybody, our panelists, one more chance for they're basically a quick last word. So 1 minute or so, final thoughts. Again, we'll go in round robin style. Kris, David, and Todd.
Well, I just want to thank everybody. Dr. Cho's presentation was phenomenal. Thank you, Kip, for being a great and gracious host. I hope I get the David Kennedy Award and be able to be invited back next year, but we'll see. David didn't get the memo. He's wearing a tie and we're not, but that's another story. But anyway, I just want to just have everybody to, when you've been in this business as long as I have, I've been in the real estate business long enough to fall in love with it, fall out of love with it, and then fall back in love with it. And many of the things that we're talking about now, to some degree, we're talking 20 years ago. And so for those people who are here as part of the audience, I just want to just kind of keep everybody encouraged in terms of, we're not where we used to be. We're not where we want to be, but we're not where we used to be. And I do see progress. And I've always been the type of person that's, looked at everything as the glass half full. I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist too. And that basically means that I think that, advocating for affordable housing and all that we do, I don't think it's, two binary things that you have to have, two mutually exclusive things that you can have affordable housing and you can make profit all at the same time. I don't see them being as mutually exclusive. So that's my take, and I appreciate being part of this panel.
Great, thanks very much. How about you, David?
Charlotte is one of the most desirable places to live in the country. And if you want to live here, you can. But you may be faced with a home buying process that can feel like you are operating at the speed of light. Regardless of the market, real estate cannot be lost or stolen. It cannot be carried away, purchased with common sense, paid for in full, and managed with reasonable care. It is about the safest investment in the world. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said that. I say it all the time at my RPAC pitches. But right now, I think, unfortunately, the safest investment one can make is also one of the most elusive investments one can make. And is owning and occupying your own home trending towards a luxury for the few? I sure hope not. My hope is that this annual report and panel discussion is a still small voice amidst the current storm of real estate activity, and a voice that helps us create conditions to balance our housing market and create a community where all housing needs are met. Thanks a lot, Kip.
Thanks, Dave. I really appreciate those comments. All right, Todd.
Sure, maybe I'll build on both David and Chris's comments a little bit. And I'll just say, we've got housing needs all across the spectrum in this region, from rental to home ownership, from affordable to luxury, including essential housing and workforce housing in between. The way to start dealing with a problem is to first recognize you have one. And summits like this and the state of housing report that we heard earlier, just extremely helpful in identifying the challenges that we have in supply and in affordability. And I, for one, I'm just excited and encouraged about the proactive nature that our region has and the role that the University of North Carolina at Charlotte is playing in this. So thank you for including me today, and thank you for all the efforts that go into this important topic.
I appreciate those comments, Todd. Thank you. Well, it seems like I know that we could talk like this for hours. Unfortunately, our time's up today. Maybe next year we'll have that nice reception where we can continue and interact with our audience. But for today, we're out of time. So I want to thank our panelists. Again, Kris Fountain, Vice President, Family Services, Habitat Charlotte Region; David Kennedy, 2021 President of Canopy Realtor Association and MLS; and Todd Williams, Chief Investment Officer at Grubb Properties. Gentlemen, thank you so much for participating in this panel discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this concludes our panel discussion, but before we conclude the event, I have 4 quick announcements to make. First, another thank you to our research partners who made this State of Housing report in Charlotte possible. That's Canopy, Crossland, Evergreen, and Libyan, Piedmont, True Homes, and of course, the Childress Klein Center for Real Estate. Secondly, I want to thank our audience for joining us today online and to attending our presentation as well as the panel. If you're interested in viewing the report, you may now do so at the following link that you see on the screen. I'm checking mine now and refreshing to see if it's there. And sure enough, it is. All right, so hopefully you can, if you're wanting a report, you can go ahead and grab that there. All right. Third, I want to make you aware of our next event with the Belk College of Business. Please join us on December 9th for the virtual North Carolina Economic Forecast. You don't want to miss this presentation. If you haven't attended one of these, you definitely are missing out, and I highly commend this to you. Lastly, please help us plan for future events by completing a short survey. By doing so, not only will you be helping us out, but you'll also be entered for a chance to win some Belk College merch and swag. So if you just scan that QR code, you'll be taken to the survey, and we greatly appreciate that. Thank you again for everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again at our future events. Have a great day.